This is Duke University.
Good afternoon. Oh, wait a minute. Y'all all must have had a very, very good lunch. Let me try that again. Good afternoon. There we are. I'm grateful for your being with us this afternoon for this year's Gardner C. Taylor lecture. This lecture has been going on since 1975 in honor of the Reverend Dr. Gardner C. Taylor. And we are excited this year to have the Reverend Dr. Dale P. Andrews. Dr. Andrews is on the faculty at Vanderbilt University Divinity School and Graduate Department of Religion. He's a distinguished professor of homiletics, social justice, and practical theology. Previously, he served on the faculty of Boston University School of Theology as the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Homiletics and Pastoral Theology. Dr. Andrews earned his MA and PhD at Vanderbilt University and his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. He was a visiting research fellow at Oxford University and has conducted 2 international study tours in Guatemala and Brazil. An ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, Dr. Andrews has served AME Zion churches in Connecticut and in New Jersey. He received numerous fellowships and awards for his studies, in addition to multiple chapters in diverse edited volumes and many journal articles. He is the author of Practical Theology for Black Churches, Bridging Black Theology in African American Folk Religion, which was published in Westminster John Knox Press in 2002, and he doesn't know was very helpful for me in getting my dissertation done. He also co-authored Listening to Listeners, Homiletic Case Studies by Chalice, which was published in 2004. And both of these are available in Cokesbury Bookstore. So if you would like to pick up his work, you will find them at Cokesbury. He's formerly served as co-editor for the Journal of Family Ministry and now serves as a co-editor of the Journal of Homiletics. He's been the president of the Academy of Homiletics, and if you heard him this morning, he needs no introduction, but I want to say a word just about the titles that he has given us. Gardner C. Taylor noted that John Henry Jewett, in his 1912 Beecher Lectures, insisted that no sermon is ready for preaching, not ready for writing out, until we can express its theme in a short, pregnant sentence, as clear as crystal. Perhaps it's not going too far to say that that applies for lectures as well. And so while many times we ask for titles well in advance, and we get these, what is sometimes called brief, breezy, bright, and brotherly titles, or I would say short, sassy, smart, and sisterly, which sometimes has absolutely nothing to do with what we're about to hear. But I just want Dr. Andrews to know that I am waiting to hear what he has to say on the idea of just couldn't keep it to myself. Preaching and the black church in the public square. Once again, we thank you for being here with us. We will have some time for question and answers after his lecture, but please will you give a warm Duke welcome to Dr. Dale P. Andrews.
Thank you. One of my colleagues at Vanderbilt, Lewis Baldwin, brilliant Martin Luther King scholar, taught me that those who deserve an introduction really don't need one, and those who need one really do not deserve one. I fear that I probably do not fare well in that proverb, so I'm thankful for the grace. I have to tell you, I almost started the sermon this morning with this little aside comment. I've learned that whenever I have to preach in a box pulpit to be a little tenuous ever since a preaching experience I had in Louisville, where I was invited to preach at this church that maybe isn't used to having black preachers. And it was a box pulpit, and I stepped into the pulpit, and I thought the earth moved there for a moment. And I paused for a moment, and trying to discern if that was the movement of the Spirit or if there was something else. And it occurred to me as I was, I don't tend to stand still when I preach, that the earth was still moving. And I realized that the pulpit was on wheels. And then I wasn't sure about my invitation to preach any longer. When you invite a black preacher to a pulpit on wheels, you're not sure what message is being communicated. So I was very grateful to step into a stationary pulpit. So I thought I might lecture from it, if you would allow me. Just couldn't keep it to myself, preaching in the black church in the public square. What is the question basically that I want to wrestle with today is, what is the proper place of the black church in the public square? And I do mean proper place. Is preaching an in-house only affair, as long as we keep it out of the big house, or perhaps I could say White House? These questions emerge for me from two prominent experiences I have repeatedly encountered in recent years. First, as a black homiletics and practical theology professor, I'm frequently asked if I believe we still need the black church today. I usually have a pretty short, curt answer to that question, but I'll try to spare you the short, curt one. You might be begging for the short, curt one by the time I get done, but I am usually astonished at the question, but have learned to answer the question by redirection. In what I, on a good day, claim is a Socratic move, I typically ask these inquirers what has caused them to question the relevance or position of the black church today. I've learned, albeit slowly, that it helps to discover the driving forces or agenda behind such baiting questions in order to optimize a generative dialogue. Two issues often emerge in the dialogue on the place or the need of the black church today. Inquisitors confess that they find that in the post-slavery, post-Jim and Jane Crow, post-civil rights era, not to mention post-modernity, that the social exigencies of a politically established church on a platform of anti-racism is no longer needed. Moreover, many of these persons claim that they suspect, in fact, that the continuance of black churches based solely in race really perpetuates the clinging vestiges of institutional or systemic marginalization based in race, which on occasion, quite surprising to me, ends with a charge of racism itself. Somehow, for these persons, the institutional maintenance or proliferation of black churches represents a racial sectarianism that betrays our gospel of redemption, reconciliation, and universal community. I can perhaps best illustrate the nature of the second question directly concerning preaching by sharing a recent event. While I was still serving as the Martin Luther King Jr. professor at Boston University, I received an invitation to preach from the university personnel charged with organizing the annual Martin Luther King birthday holiday celebration. Knowing the event to be a public forum quite removed from a worship experience or faith-related exchange, I thought perhaps my university colleagues were simply misspeaking. So as I gratefully accepted the invitation, I inquired further into that year's selected theme and as I would put it to them, the theme for the address and the event. They caught on to my language and stopped me by stressing that instead of an address, we really are asking for a sermon, as it is a central part of King's identity and mission. I attempted to suggest perhaps I should offer up what I call a surdress, A little bit of address, a little bit of sermon. They resisted by invoking the invitation to preach. Reluctantly, but actually kind of intrigued, I agreed. I cannot tell you, though, how many persons approached me later that same day and for the weeks to follow, asking me why in the world would I actually preach at such a non-worship or non-faith-based event, even if one would suppose an interfaith-based event. This particular experience led me to question if preaching has even a democratic public space, or a designed restricted, or is it it's a space only a designed restricted church public. If we need to retain a dramatic distinction, what then is in-house versus, forgive the outhouse preaching? How do they differ, or should they differ, if so? Both experiences of being questioned about the black church and this experience about the public space of preaching itself, both experiences and the respective questions raise difficult demands on our critical attention on the relationships between the church and social political ministry and the voice of preaching in public debates or political challenge. To these demands, I hope to turn our attention. Do we still need the black church? Do we know our proper place? Is there a crisis even in black preaching itself? These relevant questions, I trust are relevant, imply an admission that at the very least we have needed the black church in some not so distant past. The language of do we still need it implies that there was a needed time. And black preaching once held a critical place. When we dive into the proper place of preaching, we certainly must struggle with the purpose or theology of preaching itself. These struggles are not independent from challenges to the mission or ministry of the church. We typically make dramatic claims of authority and authoritative resources. For black preaching traditions, as with most Christian traditions, the more obvious claims of authority are theological appeals to sacred sources, specifically divine inspiration and Scripture. Divine inspiration functions as authoritative revelation specific to the activities of preaching, inclusive of sermon preparation, hopefully, and the preaching event itself. Scripture, then, more observably becomes both a historical and meta-historical deposit of divine revelation that the church discerned with some difficulty. Even when church traditions wrestle with the theological and functional claims about the divine inspiration of Scripture, the authority of sacred revelation or divine sanction is at the heart of the debate. The nature and task of preaching emerge from similar theological debates. These debates claim a great deal of space in both our personal and public lives. Mirrored in the divine sanction of Scripture, then, are theological claims of God's own activity in preaching that seek to interpret Scripture for contemporary life. In essence, the mirror reflects divine sanction into the preaching event. Herein subsist critical questions for preachers. Are we addressing struggles within a local community of faith or the congregation's engagement with an ever-expanding world? How does the authority of divine revelation and divine sanction of preaching translate into the mission of preaching in the faith community and in the public square? Is preaching primarily concerned with the life of faith that nurtures spiritual formation, or is it concerned more so with a public theology that seeks to transform social encounters, culture, politics, economics, global engagement? Is there a proper place for preaching within the walls of a church? Or not is there, is the proper place for preaching within the walls of the church? Is witness limited properly to invitation to the party line?
Or is the proper place of preaching within the public debates of local, national, and global life? Is public engagement of preaching limited properly to public appeals to charitable life? These questions, both explicit and implicit, receive a great deal of attention in some form or another in almost any homiletics text that wrestles with the theology of preaching or the mission of the church. Such questions explore the dialectic relationship between pastoral preaching and prophetic preaching. Our questions, however, are not so clear. At least they're not so clear to me today. If the past 10 years since 9/11 terror have not revealed the complexities of the proper place of faith claims upon public life and public policy, we certainly have considerable difficulty delineating the line of the public place of faith in current political climate gearing up to the 2012 presidential campaign. It is often difficult to distinguish between political speech and preaching forays into public claims of faithfulness. Faithfulness to religious tradition and faithfulness to national identity become blurred in the rancor of privilege and power holders. The conflicts become even more difficult to decipher when we consider the proper place of the marginalized voices of many black churches. The presidential campaign of 2008 in the United States exposed such conflicts dramatically. When the Reverend Jeremiah Wright preached God's disfavor of our nation and our culture, riddled with terroristic economic and political dominance of others within and without our borders. Can race or poverty or challenge to faithful dominance by any means necessary enter into the White House, or is it really the big house? The fear of our culture or nation over any intended critical challenge to perceived divine favor continues to be stunning, though not all that surprising. What then is the proper place of such voices? If the black church has had such a historical role in our culture and nation, what then is the proper place of black preaching or the black church? This analysis attempts to explore much of black preaching that engages social crises locally and globally today. Whether the pastoral prophetic dialectic functions well in black churches is a chief concern for me. However, the need to sustain this dialectic is not a new argument. The recent crises facing black churches in such tragedies as Hurricane Katrina, the terrorism of 9/11, and our own terrorism of preemptive war expose deep theological problems in our preaching. The involvement of black churches in prosperity preaching, black political speech against affirmative action, black entrepreneurs joining the ranks of Tea Party faithful rights, are in the very least confusing in light of the immediate social historical inheritance of these churches and public traditions. This, therefore, challenges black churches to reflect further on the pastoral prophetic dialectic for congregational life and the mission of the black church. The dialectic may be insufficient in and of itself to hold together the necessary balance or tension that should be part of any dialectic. Not only do we seek to hold our political culture and principles in the separation of church and state, we also separate our faith principles between the proper places of pastoral and prophetic ministries, or so we think. Is there a priestly office to the church and society that wrestles with the pastoral and prophetic tension and understanding congregational faith identity, mission, and the practices of black churches that live in between the sacred and profane worlds, between spiritual formation and liberation ethics, between worship and social transformation, between the places of parish and public theology? For historical black preaching traditions, even those debated between otherworldly and thisworldly preaching, the encounter between spiritual formation or soul survival and social crises or liberation are difficult to isolate in that preachers often transport theological claims uncritically. This phenomenon remains prevalent today. Our attempt here is to nurture faithful practices between spiritual discipleship and social engagement across forms of moral values, civil rights, public policy, economics, and global exigencies. In recent years, we have experienced particular difficulty in sermons addressing events like Hurricane Katrina, the unrelenting Middle East crises, and conflicts involving desperate acts of violence and terrorism sponsored by both small cells and nation states. And the acts of terrorism in America with our own desperate deployment of terror and preemptive war, or acts of international human rights violations therein. Occasions for the encounter of preaching to wrestle with the conflict between spiritual formation and social agency are not limited, though, to these horrific events. Crises seldom emerge from isolation. In fact, crises are hardly ever treated adequately as individual episodes. Political and economic systems affect and also respond to climates of moral values. The life of the church lives within such climates. How do we clothe ourselves or move through life is not simply determined by the daily climate, but also by the theological worldviews, the faith identity, and the mission of the church. For the lives of hopeful witness within the church, preaching functions as a primary arbiter of the overwhelming threats upon personhood, personal thriving, and social engagement. We hear sermons formed directly from theologies of election, of triumphalism, of holding out for a raptured rescue, and even of conquest. Still, we also hear sermons formed in the theologies of resistance, of engagement, of transformation, and on a good day, even of reconciliation. What makes the diagnosis of our preaching difficult is that these strands are often confused in our sermons, and we make incredible claims upon God and incredible claims upon divine sanction. A tragic irony emerges when we take a close look at the theological worldviews undergirding espoused moral values in lives of faith and in public life. When black preaching enjoins divine sanction in wrestling with tragedies or suffering, or perceives illness as divine judgment upon supposed sin, or charges servitude and poverty as evidence of unfaithfulness or the wrong faith, then black preaching employs the same ideological, theological worldviews that have historically defined the violent domination and marginalization of African Americans and African peoples. It is agonizing to decipher in that the judgment is directed both outwardly and inwardly. Whether by acts of nature or human agency, we preach the righteousness of violent reprisal as God's judgment upon our own nations and moral culture. And yet, we also claim the call of election as the predominant Christian nation with the blessed inheritance and authority to represent, or rather exact, God's judgment globally. Lest we believe such sermons are limited to the occasional episodes of national crises, we find the same kind of theology and ideology in those sermons against homosexuality or sustaining gender subjugation. We select disparate methods of interpreting Scripture and employ biblical authority to fit our ideology and theological presuppositions of empowered privilege. And we end up employing historically ideological arguments used for racial oppression and now direct them for our own dominance of others in forms of exclusion and violence. In our current international political climate, we make similar charges when black churches join privileged power in the divine charges of faith to rid ourselves of the unfaithful other. We confuse the very real dilemma of how to resist evil and witness to divine revelation, never far from the conquest of triumphant divine favor, where spiritual and moral piety is never far from political determinism. Privilege seeks to preserve its predominance, and apparently so does mitigated privilege that is afforded black churches or black life in today's society. Such sermons delineate the evidence of divine sanction and even mitigated privilege without a critical evaluation of human systems and relationships. The prosperity gospel preaches privilege because of faith and grace together. Some black preachers preaching prosperity do not necessarily lack important social ministries seeking to alleviate suffering. Somehow, however, an uncritical attribution occurs by implication, at the very least, that ascribes suffering or hardship to a lack of faithfulness or a lack of the right faith. The result is that the preponderance of prophetic preaching determines that people need only to be saved from their sins in order to find liberation from their course of suffering. Of course, Christian theology has long wrestled with the notion of sin, with its effect on human history, and with our own immediate frustrations over how we contribute to our own experiences of despair. While preaching salvation is central, indispensable even, to the gospel message, preaching from the margins enlists with preaching from tyrannical pulpits of dominant society when sermons equate our liberation with some divine election beyond our shared createdness and God's commitment to the oppressed of humanity. The dynamics of election, privilege, power, faith, God's faithfulness, and God's desire to bless us converge in purported divine callings of faith, identity, and mission. These dynamics in our preaching are dramatically exposed, for example, in the Middle East crises of the American war on Iraq, for example, and in complex warring exchanges between Israel and the Palestinian people. Despite the exposure, we have become unrestrained in various responses to violent tragedies. The sacred scriptures of all three warring world religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, contain problematic interpretations of God's self-revelation and violent intervention in human history, as well as promises of violent vindication in an eschatological future. In each of these faith traditions, the divine sanction of human violence flies in the very face of the very character of God in love, mercy, grace, and reconciliation. For example, the Israelite call to arms to dispossess the Canaanites, the Christian claims of a future secured with divine war, an Islamic divine and moral justification of violence and defending the purity of faith, all conflate in common ideological and theological worldviews of divine election and liberation, held together by divine sanction of dominance and exoneration, if not justification of violent reprisal itself. What has happened in black preaching when it enjoins our experiences of even mitigated privilege or mitigated liberation with the voices of divinely sanctioned human domination? Like many of the white mainline churches, black churches have toyed with tragic interpretations of catastrophe and have chronically given divine sanction to the ideology of elected domination. I believe two important factors warrant our exploration here. First, our preaching demonstrates that we may have replicated the tragic manipulation of God's faithfulness or commitment to the oppressed of humanity into an ontological claim that divine election no longer simply sanctions our liberation, but rather it seeks to justify a misguided telos to join the ranks of domination. And second, when preaching responds to suffering or simply to difference with claims of divine sanction or moral favor, if not violent reprisal, then there has been a tragic breakdown between pastoral theology and prophetic consciousness in preaching. a reconsideration of the proper place of black preaching and the proper place of the historical black church in a global political economy could offer a forum to transform our preaching within a liberation reconciliation dialectic, comprising spiritual formation, faith identity, and the mission of the church in public theology, and maybe even in public policy. What have we learned then from such historical movements like the Civil Rights era? The current climate of retrenchment in American politics of sustaining power and privilege bears incredible similarities to the battles over both willful and culturally systemic racism of the Civil Rights era and thereafter. For example, the backlash against affirmative action policies, designed and implemented as correctives to the effects of willful or cultural racism, is evidenced by a recent conservative Supreme Court decision against schools trying to ensure diversity in learning, a practical reversal of the historic Brown versus Board of Ed decision of 1954, or even a Berkeley student body group advertising a bake sale where whites would be charged $3. I've forgotten the breakdown. Whites are charged $3, Asians are charged $150, Latinos $125, African Americans $75, and all women gets 25% off of their category, or 25 cents off, as their objection to affirmative action proposal in Berkeley. They do not include in that objection a refutation of the legacy policies of admission, where inherited privilege is a form of admission policy. Inherited privilege is a form of admission policy. But the deconstruction of privilege is a violation of human equality and political sanction. In such events, where is the prophetic voice of the black church or black preaching? Does the church have the proper place in the debate, or is it a matter of public policy resulting from legal interpretations of constitutional law in a nation culture of separation of church and state? The current prevailing American myth that we have achieved a level playing field has clouded our vision, if not silenced our voices. Mitigated privilege, perhaps, continues to co-opt our interest in liberation. The lack of response from black pulpits has been equally perplexing regarding our recent national politics to override international laws or practices against such thing as torture, habeas corpus, or imprisonment policies. Not to mention abeyance of domestic rights of citizenship and illegal surveillance of citizens ordered by the previous executive administration. Or perhaps a death penalty policy that puts to death over 2/3 of its candidates from black poor, wherein over 100 of those cases had been exonerated by DNA findings after their death. Are these secular matters for which the church does not bear responsibility to redress? Similarly, American pulpits have avoided the overwhelming conflicts of violence in the Middle East. We have avoided and our own theological and ideological duplicity in the crises. This duplicity between faith and politics to protect privilege and power has been dramatically exposed in the events of terrorism in America and our political and military response globally. The struggles we have between the church and American culture strike disconcerting chords of familiarity with the latter years of the Civil Rights era. In the pastoral prophetic debates of church leaders, the Vietnam War, and even MLK's call for a revolution of values to overcome the triple threat of extreme evil and racism, materialism, and militarism. So what have we learned from the civil rights era regarding the pastoral and prophetic preaching, dialectic, or pastoral care and prophetic care. And I am indebted to a colleague, Andre Resner, for that term, prophetic care, in some of his work. Recent public debates over black preaching during the last presidential campaign primary season raises stark comparisons with the reaction to the role of black churches and black preaching in public policies of segregation during the first several campaigns of civil rights movement. Does black preaching cross the proverbial line separating church and state when warning God's judgment upon American political and economic policies or culture? Does a 10-second clip from a sermon cause such outrage in a 10-second clip from a sermon cause such outrage in a political campaign in that a church proclaiming religious, cultural, and political criticism might have shaped a candidate that we could fear? Is the reaction over some perceived violation of the black church into matters of state? Or is the outrage over some threat to the dominant culture's perceptions or claims to divine favor, if not divine election? Perhaps it is still the outrage of black reaction to white election. I raise these issues together because I am not sure that they can be treated separately. And this is precisely the question really at stake, challenging the proper place of black preaching in the black church today. Is the outrage then that the church might awaken from our slumber of complacency or satisfaction with inherited and growing privilege? The outrage for me does reflect the desire for a church to remain in line with cultural norms of political and national culture. From the jails of civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. challenged both the complacency and the outrage together. Disappointment looms large with the church's ability to relegate social issues to matters of proper lawfulness, or to elevate the concerns of personal salvation over and against the social and political ethics of justice. Even passive adherence shares culpability in sanctioning injustice. King's critical assessment of the church and the status quo was not limited to white churches, and we must hear that. The black church exists somewhere in the middle of complacency and bitterness. Complacency has been derived from an effectual impotence in the face of resilient racism and unrelenting economic oppression. Bitterness lends itself to a mutation of moral values that accept and adopt the nature of power, tied up in violence and privilege. King observed these forces operating throughout the black community. Black churches have seldom, if ever, escaped destructive forces. Like white churches, black churches have been unable to escape the shackles of the status quo. In fact, one of King's unremitting challenges to the black community and church was really an admonition that passive endurance or ethical appeals without agency basically failed to understand the structures and resilience of injustice. Oddly enough, today's maintenance of the cultural status quo may have further merged with privilege in some instances to create a prevailing phenomena of the megachurch, both white and black alike. As described earlier, a preaching doctrine of privilege and power, known to us as the prosperity gospel, locates and celebrates a divine election of personal thriving in both the spiritual and material favor of God's grace. Grace becomes contractual in that our worship and mission seek privilege and power. And faithfulness is evidenced in attaining privilege and power. When suffering or injustice prevails, one is faced with unavoidable implications of unfaithfulness, which might be rectified by confession and spiritual transformation. When the nation and the church become satisfied in self-portrayal of righteousness, the result has been a divine sanction of privilege and power pervading worship, pervading religious moral values and social agency. Hence, the prominence of the prosperity gospel has not been limited to mega churches, and this is an unbelievable phenomenon. Mega churches are a byproduct, granted a fairly inflated one. Even struggling storefront churches and the dignified stature of wealthier churches reflect a buy-in to the prosperity gospel of the American civic, political, and economic national self-image and the maintenance or interpretation in kind provided by American churches. Now, I'm not trying to disparage praying for help. I'd be lying if I told you I stopped praying for help. All right, it's the contractual binding of God's grace into a sanction of my election and my privilege and power that then interprets my engagement of the other. The reflection of prosperity preaching at polar experiences of American culture in poor and wealthy churches, in black and white churches, and religious traditions fundamentally reveal the powerful allure of the status quo, or at least access to more of the status quo, of even desired privilege, if not its power to overwhelm and consume. The prosperity gospel reflects more than a phenomenon among white and black churches. The character of religious moral values and interpretations of American privilege and power conflate in creating a national or cultural religious self-identity of divine sanction and moral supremacy. For black churches, we have moved beyond the passive cooperation with injustice against which King warned us. Even with passive cooperation, King cautioned, the evil of oppression consumes us, and we are in turn co-opted as co-progenitors of the evil. Today, too, many black churches buy into the American myth that not only do we possess divine favor to the exclusion of different others, but believe also that all moral good rests in our explicit eradication of the evil other. Otherness is not simply determined by those who oppose us, although the assault on the American myth makes our mission an easily justified enterprise. Rather, otherness is determined by the absence of favor, or the absence of privilege, or the absence of power, identified particularly through cultural images in mirrors that reflect our sanctioned selves, even if those are only images of mitigated privilege and leftover power. As in the civil rights era, our temptation in the divine sanction of the status quo is to resort to rejection and violence. Even when we sustain ministries to alleviate suffering, in many cases, those ministries serve the cultural power of privilege and divine sanction. I believe the buy-in to the divine sanction of the status quo in personal thriving and social identity exposes a collapse in the desired mutual tension between pastoral care and prophetic care, between pastoral preaching and prophetic preaching. The lost dialectic is not simply a consequence, but a force that takes on agency in sustaining the status quo of privileged culture and even mitigated privileged access. To repair the breach, we are faced with understanding the mutuality of the pastoral and prophetic in the preaching life of the faith community and its mission or proper place of participation in the world. The black church traditions cannot afford to ignore the question of the role in society when cultural dynamics of race do change. Has the mission or place of the black church changed? Did Jeremiah Wright violate that change? For the sake of transparency, I do not think Reverend Wright violated the place of black preaching or the place of the black church in the public square. An argument, however, could be made for a missed opportunity for the pastoral office in the news media interviews that followed. However, the prophetic challenge, I believe, reflected the inherited functions of black preaching and the inherited place of the black church in public theology and public policy, even though the sermon is an in-house preaching event. So we claim. Apparently, this is Wright's own understanding of black preaching and black church traditions. In an essay he entitled An Underground Theology, Wright argues that all of Pan-African, and this was before 2008, all of Pan-African worship practices, from music to preaching, emerge under an evolving story shaped by and for understanding ourselves in a historical context, but as divine or spiritual creations and the world at large. Affirming and evolving that story has shaped an underground theology that moves in resistance and refusal of destructive encounters to our humanity and our thriving in human relationship with the divine and the world. This story functions, however, both pastorally and prophetically, as healing in the empowerment to the soul and redefinition by and of the community and the community function in the assaulting world. Is this sense of prophetic care from the margins of society and it is in this sense that I argue that prophetic care from the margins of society is also pastoral care. Malefikete Asante argues that black discourse in the Pan-African or black experience has to be resistance itself in order to be healthy discourse. It is part of that sacred storytelling function of the past and present, but for the future as well. In this sacred discourse, both black salvation and world salvation confronts, without apology, oppression over the violation of humanity and the world, calling for divine intervention and human participation. The discourse of divine intervention and human participation not only shapes the spiritual function of preaching, but also the worship community. The rhetoric of resistance, as Asante calls it, involves hearerships. Hearerships entails an intended relationship between speaker and community, or speaker and audience. But the speaker has the opportunity to choose particular hearerships. The selected hearership becomes one of the resources as well as focus of the preaching event. For Asante, the black orator seeks to create new understanding or invoke new worldviews. In so doing, the speaker uses language, symbols, and material from the world of the hearership or the selected hearership that are somewhat different for the black preacher from the ruling order. I would press Asante a bit further here to argue that preachers also resource overhearers, if you will, or overhearerships. Black preaching traditions will preach to the overhearing ruling order, even in addressing oneself to the hearership of one's own community, and vice versa. To illustrate my point here, let us consider the more established understanding of black preachers throughout history who would be called upon to preach to a black hearership within a dominating white hearership. The rhetoric of resistance would pull from the black hearership, while the dominating white hearership listened for their own resourcing, or the resourcing they wanted the black hearership to receive. Stay with me. Let's be careful to understand the intricacies here. like spirituals sung in the open field, containing resourcing and messages for the hearership of the invisible institution, black preaching traditions speak to the dominating traditions, but also speak rhetoric of resistance and transformation in the language of a selected hearership and an intended overhearership. With the evolving or mutating forms of oppression, along with evolving forms of freedom or liberation, the balance of hearerships and overhearerships may adjust, as does the rhetoric of resistance. A message of resistance and liberation could make appeals to the faith that are directed to the overhearing culture. As black preaching has been invited into the mainstream preaching culture, the hearerships themselves are changing, as mitigated privilege or disparate levels of marginalization are experienced, as well as evolving cultural alliances and evolving self-identifications. The question from Asante, then, is whether black preaching is no longer black preaching if it loses sight of its shared hearership of oppression and resistance to oppression, or its needs of social political liberation. Prosperity preaching locates the shared need of liberation from economic suffering along with spiritual suffering, but not in the rhetoric of resistance and transformation. The shift has occurred that once when prosperity preaching was a form of resistance to oppression, to overcome oppression, to seek God's inbreaking grace in oppression, now we've lost the sense of refusal and resistance, and we have adopted what was resistance to the overhearership and taken the rhetoric of the overhearership and made it our own as God's liberation. If resistance even enters, it is resistance to moral decay of righteousness or resistance to the demons of faithlessness in divine favor. The problem we face in today's lecture is whether the balance is lost altogether, and therefore the role of rhetorical resistance. Are black preaching and the black church dependent on rhetoric of resistance and liberation for existence? We have to face that question. If so, then what is the necessary balance in the resourcing and the focus on hearerships and overhearerships in the current political, social, economic market of the public square? If not, then perhaps the prosperity gospel has its rightful place in divine sanction of privilege, as long as we sustain a charitable disposition to those have-nots, even though it's now likely by their own depravity, or supposedly not by the depravity of privilege, that they have not. Some persons might argue that the prophetic appeal here is most appropriately addressed within the pastoral office of preaching in the church and not the public square. This viewpoint often holds the separation of church and state renders the prophetic an office within the church life of charity. I'm not sure I said that clearly. This viewpoint often holds that the separation of church and state renders persons choosing a faith, renders the prophetic office within the church life of charity. That's our public office in the separation of church and state. Our prophetic office in the public square is an office of charity in the separation of church and state. Sometimes you got to trust your instincts and not your writing. Political resistance is a social function, then, of democratic freedom, and the public debate on social ethics is about constitutional or civic political rights of thriving or moral political sanction. Are these political and moral debates of democratic freedom or civil rights separate from pastoral or prophetic functions of the church? Is it possible for black preaching or the black church to accept concrete definitions of separation of church and state in the dialectic of the pastoral and prophetic office? The separation of the church and state seems like separation of the church voices challenging the dominant culture of the state. Where does the separation become blurred currently in political campaigns grounded in economic thriving, political global dominance of Christian state, or confronting the access of evil? Another case, or is capital punishment executed in separation of church and state? Are immigration walls built in the separation of church and state? Are exclusionary policies and laws rooted in appeals to the moral sanctity of marriage and sexuality, or even gender, enacted in the separation of church and state? Is stem cell research funding doled out in the separation of church and state? Are wars raised and torture enacted under the banner of self-defense determined in the separation of church and state? Mary Doak argues that we construct national narratives much like faith narratives. She helps us to question what role does the homogeneity of our national narrative play in public debates, which cause us to question the impact of our heterogeneity upon our perceived divine favor in the separation of church and state. For our driving question on black preaching in the need of the black church in the public square, Doak's analysis should cause us to question, how do we embrace the narrative of heterogeneity in our very pursuit of faithful engagement in the public arena? Does such an embrace result in unfaithfulness to our divine revelation of the gospel, of any claims of divine revelation itself? The issues here might be addressed by the obvious fact that religious adherents have public debates even on faith issues and faith identity in national or political narratives. Is there a convergence of faith narratives and democratic narratives, or are we left only with the option of theocratic vying? I believe black preaching traditions and the historical emergence of the black church, both rooted in refusal, resistance, and reformation between the pastoral and the prophetic dialectic of faith narratives, very much having to do so with the personal and public political life together, continue to offer potential guidance beyond just the argument that racial oppression mutates and thrives systemically and culturally well into politics, law enforcement, and economics. Can a healing and justice dialectic be adequate mission and function for public theology in a heterogeneous national narrative? When the dialectic between healing and justice collapses, we lose sight of the extent of personal suffering or the pervasiveness of social oppression. When black preaching and the black church has been most effective to black wholeness and black liberation, they have held these missions of healing and justice together. Healing was a form of resistance as much as justice making. And justice making was as much a form of healing as personal salvation. The priestly office, I believe, when we face a collapse of the pastoral and prophetic dialectic, or a collapse of the healing and justice dialectic in a national public square or in a national narrative, there might be another office of the church that could help us in the collapse. And I want to explore the possibility, and we might have to do that in a Q&A section, of the priestly office of the church, or the priestly office of the pulpit, and what it carries in the demands of critical care to the tension itself. I believe the place of black preaching and the black church in the public square might be desperately needed in the priestly office, navigating and even shepherding the critical dialectic between healing and justice in a public narrative of heterogeneity and global engagement. Black preaching historically shaped black ecclesiology in the dialectic of pastoral care and personal wholeness and prophetic care through the community of faith as witness to an intervention in an oppressive world at large. Faith, identity, and mission come together in the dialectic of rhetoric of resistance, resistance to the destructive acts or ideology on the spiritual health of the human soul and the human well-being in community. When the dialectic of resistance collapses from the gospel of salvation, we risk losing the social conscience of the gospel witness itself. The call to witness may at times require our dissent from the claims of privilege and culture of power. Prophetic black preaching traditions grew in a call for the church at large to enter into this creative dissent. A collapse in the dialectic incurs a great loss of the creative power of dissent, the creative power to challenge our culture of privilege and power both inside and outside of the church, as well as from inside and outside the cultural life of the moral, political, and economic challenges of public or community life in society. God's care for the world seeks to confront suffering and injustice. Our pulpits evade that encounter when we preach a myopic telos in divine election to prosperity, privilege, and power. The pastoral prophetic dialectic, or the healing and injustice dialectic, also collapses when we make enemies out of those to whom we preach. Prophetic preaching will at times involve strident criticism. However, the dialectic with the pastoral reminds us that prophetic preaching is meant to be prophetic care. Prophetic care for the world speaks against the threat to human meaning and relationship. The dialectic sustains God's story as a counter-narrative to our national narrative, as a counter-narrative to our claims of divine election in our faith narratives, to our counter-narratives or eternal narrative to human worldviews of meaning and relationship constructed in cultures of power and privilege. Prophetic preaching draws from the history of God's story, and it envisions the future of God's story in order to discern and proclaim God's immediate inbreaking and even resistance for reorientation for the world. Too often, we limit reconciliation to our theological understandings of our own return to God. Yet prophetic counsel reminds us that our return to God entails resistance to willful and implicit injustice, suffering, and the work of human reconciliation. Prophetic consciousness seeks God in reconciliation and confronts suffering or injustice in our substance, and our substance even in the public square of our lives. Proponents of pastoral preaching and prophetic preaching typically agree that preaching theologically shapes the internal and social consciousness of communities of faith. The congregation becomes the church when it gathers around work and sacraments. I have tried to show that the church reflexively forms its identity and mission in the encounter with divine care, both pastoral and prophetic. The gist of my argument here is that the church is called into relationship with God and into service of God's care for the world. But this care for the world must also be in relationship with God. Human meaning and relationship in the pastoral care of nurture and wholeness are in creative tension with human meaning and relationship in prophetic care of justice and relief from suffering. When the priestly office is held in service to the transforming presence of God in worship community, rather than the arbiter of God's presence, this forms possibilities of challenge to both the pastoral and the prophetic offices of preaching and the church's mission in the public square. The collapsed pastoral prophetic dialectic between God's care for the community of faith and God's care for the world faces a desirable tension with the priestly office of preaching. Priestly preaching must correlate how God's presence continuously transforms meaning and relationship in who we are and how that formation transforms our meaning and relationship with the world, and ultimately seeks to guide persons of faith and how we may engage public debate and political challenge. The praxis of worship is itself even a public affair. Gathering to worship God in a public practice rooted in theological reflection on God, on the encounter with God. It is not simply the pursuit of personal meaningfulness. Parker Palmer argues that in worship, the private and the public are interdependent. In worship, we are not left alone to dwell within our own private transformation of meaning. The worship community is a public arena wherein our relatedness is part of our human meaning and our human transformation. The promise of God's presence gathers us into public worship, but the shared experience of transformation has a social life. When we move, when we send forth from worship. Of course, the implied question for our consideration of the priestly engagement with the pastoral and prophetic offices of preaching is, what is the social life of transformation in the public square? Practical theologian Johannes van der Ven defines the structural aspect of praxis as the transforming mechanism of the church. The church does not exist in isolation at any micro level. It exists interdependently with dominant public culture or a dominant culture of our world. The priestly office of preaching joins, I believe, with Van der Ven and asks, how is the church itself a transforming mechanism in the public square? In considering the priestly office of black preaching and the black church in particular, I understand Van der Ven's structural aspect of praxis as the ability to learn from the encounter with God and the experience of transformation, which in turn translates into practices of resistance for the sake of transformation and liberation. Both pastoral and prophetic preaching, therefore, call upon the priestly office of preaching to translate the transforming identity of the worship community into transforming practices that form faith identity, true, but also form mission care in a heterogeneous world. For the sake of the world, for care of the world, for their own sake, in their own createdness as God's creatures. And God's own desire to be reconciled with humanity. Seeking a world transformed by reconciliation, not transformed by power and privilege, not transformed by divine election, not transformed by divine favor, but transformed by reconciliation. And reconciliation that continually seeks out resistance to the impediments of that transformation. To the impediments of that reconciliation. Privilege and power must be transformed in the public arena. Their pursuit is not the focus of worship, but they must be transformed in the public arena. In fact, one scholar points out that despite the obvious desire for divine blessing, priestly practice does not place the pursuit of material blessing at the center of its office. Instead, sanctification and covenantal relationship are held together and become central together. Therein, creative dissent forms with the pastoral and the prophetic. When the worship community struggles with meaning and faith, the pastoral office joins with the priestly in the restoration of transformed relationship. When the worship community becomes self-indulged, prophetic preaching calls upon the worship life of the community into account for the public life of the church and the world, an intrinsic praxis of transformation. The prosperity gospel of material blessings cannot evidence faith identity without mission, nor can the violent reprisal of confused justice invoke God's name. The public square does, in fact, complicate our priestly engagement with political life. But prophetic care is able to voice pastoral and spiritual values in the notion of divine care for justice without relegating the place or relevance of that voice to be within or remain only within the church walls. Does the priestly office have a public or political ministry? Quite frankly, I believe some of the more painful fights over civil liberties or debates for public policy over moral and political values occur in the unrecognized theological claims of priestly office to represent faith identity before God in community in the culture of dominance. The debates over the separation of church and state do little to convince either liberal or conservative faith advocates, or secularists for that matter, over where the churchyard ends and the separate politics of democratic thriving begin. Is the separation about freedom of religion, or is the separation about freedom from religion, as it is often put? Or is the separation truly a political value trying to protect us from the injustice of supposed divinely sanctioned hegemony of perceived divine favor emanating from faith identity? Does not the history of black preaching and the black church teach us that there exists a priestly office between the pastoral and the prophetic, which God cares for the soul and the social life of humanity, and the church stands as a community of faith and yet operates between care for the suffering soul seeking healing and care for the oppressed humanity seeking liberation? The church does speak with the voice of faith, but it can place demands on faith in order to seek the healing or liberation of the other for its own sake. When black preaching and the black church claim divine sanction of privilege or divine favor in anything but God's pastoral and prophetic care of personal and interpersonal reconciliation, seeking freedom from spiritual and political depravity, then we lose sight of the rhetoric of resistance and the grace of God. We do not possess divine favor. We are possessed by the grace of God. Black preaching traditions can speak of God's judgment as resistance to injustice, violating God's desire for reconciliation with and among humanity. We can preach divine disfavor of storing up the manna of grace to preserve life. The manna of grace spoils in storehouses of privilege and power. The manna of grace spoils when hoarded for one's own self-preservation only. When we do not seek its political and economic life in resistance to the spiritual suffering and political and economic depravity of hoarding itself or denial. The means are never discerned without the ends, and neither is absent from God's own practices with humanity. Separation of church and state may mean respect and care for the other, as does the engagement of the church continually within the public square, resisting the defilement of divine grace, not divine favor of the human other. Divine grace does not defile the sanctity of the other, nor does it absent itself from engaging in any aspects of our lives, even in the public square. I think I should end there.
Wow. That was more than just a question about the black church in the public square, and brings us some self-critique in the black pulpit, as well as once again allows the question for the black pulpit to speak to the church at large. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews, for placing that before us. And I am certain that you have questions that have been tickled in your mind as you heard this. Maybe some places you'd like to push back, get some more information, and maybe just something that Dr. Andrews may not have thought about that you want to push him on. So we have mics that will be made available to you if you have questions or comments. I open the floor for you to do that at this time.
penetrating, provocative, and hopefully helpful presentation that signals some serious work that is to come. As I sat and listened, I could not help but feel myself reliving the moments of emerging black theology right at that pivotal point between toward the end of the civil rights era, where the great question was which way to go. It's like that moment being relived where from within the church there were persons who arose to press the question of what kind of people we should be. And fortunately, during that era, there was a cadre of preachers, really, who were then followed by theologians who helped to show the way. Here's my question, I guess it's a question. How do we reinstantiate such a moment where there is such a predominance and even stranglehold of the media, money-driven presentation of what the gospel is for everybody, if you will, in the face of a muted prophetic pulpit in such a way that it can then begin to shape what the model might look like for a new generation that does not have the memory that was resourcing the work in the late 60s and early 70s. That's what I'm struggling with. How the image of the church and the image of the pulpit is being shaped in this day and time. It's almost as if there is another narrative that you beginning to articulate of what black means as some kind of normative, historical, and theological a construct. Is there a question in that you can hear, or have I?
Probably more than one. I think so. I'm going to take that as an invitation to tackle points that intrigue me in your reflection. First, 2 points in particular. One has to do with the place where our conversation today has brought you, to the historical place of the emergence of black power, and coming from black church leaders and being articulated through a theological voice. That movement, I believe, replicated another movement in the institutionalization of the establishment of the black church, the institutional black church, in a different capacity. That somehow in resistance to power, we found historically that one of the forms of resistance is to acquire power. All right, and so that even the establishment of the institutional black church wasn't, my own denomination did not start, Amy Zion did not start in theological debate. All right, it did not start with doctrinal dissension. It started with political dissension and cultural dissension and resistance. And the way to resist racial power, racialized power, was to establish independent power.
And so you always have in the development of the history of the black church that there is a perceived form of resistance in establishing our institutional presence of power and power brokering in the black community and their emanating beyond. Black power struggled with a frustration of the concept of integration. And that integration is seeing that the manipulation of racist power, all right, of integration led to a frustration, and the reaction was to acquire power as a form of resistance. And then black theology attempts to give a theological voice and understanding to the need for acquisition of independent power, or the claim of the power of human dignity and the power of social liberation. And we did that through God's own interest in humanity. These are important moves. Because resisting power does actually require power. But I think what we find disturbing in any evolution of the church in the public square is that when we buy, what we do will not be absent from human nature, and therefore what we do will also carry the depravity of human nature. And when you seek the acquisition of power in resistance to abusive power, we have to work hard at the creative dissension from our replication of destructive power. And I don't think we've done that critically well. And so that when we do acquire different forms of power, and we seek to acquire economic power, political power, that we start to enjoy the experience of power, and we lose sight of the critical dissension that enabled us to acquire even that mitigated power. And maybe by working at that creative dissension and the rhetoric of resistance, or the mission of the church within ourselves, is our vehicle with how our continued life ought to be in the public square. That we have to continually transform the nature of our own acquired power, even as we seek to transform the nature of the dominant power. The acquisition of power, and that says, well, so the victim bears the responsibility of the transformation of the oppressor. And so God entered humanity and sought to participate with humanity, to transform power within the depravity of power, with creative dissension of power, but yet trying to acquire a transforming power. And that's why divine election does not work for the black church. You know, I often joke around that, the doctrine, even though Augustine might be more responsible than Calvin, only a white European, northern white European male could come up with double election. I won't defend that comment, but I do play with it often. Right? There is something about claiming divine favor as the source of our power that is problematic. Right? Maybe we claim divine inbreaking as the source of our power. We claim God's divine faithfulness to deconstruct power continually until we grow closer to divine power of reconciliation, love, mercy, transformation, and grace. That God is not known. Wrath is not absent from God. But even God repents. We got biblical literatures. God repents from God's own wrath in the interest of grace, reconciliation, transformation of power. And maybe that's what we have to do with our acquisition of power as part of our resistance to cultural dominance. So that, do I say we stop trying to get power? Hell no. But how we get it is not absent from what we do with it. And we have to seek a transformation of the employment of power. And I do believe black preaching and the black church as a form of resistance toward reconciliation has been the gift of God to humanity in at least this world of Pan-African life. I hope that answered a question or two in there. He's saying, I can come up with one.
Well, I, as you were talking about Reverend Wright and the whatever chaos that was that happened after that, I got into a conversation with a cousin and appreciated your reference to that in the sermon, a cousin. We eat at the same table and all, but we had quite a, what I thought was a bit of an odd conversation in which I had apparently on my Facebook page it indicated that I liked Obama, and he just took me to task. I'd characterize him as a right-wing, rural, white male. Not unlike myself, but how we ended up in so many different places, I don't know. Anyway, really took me to task and asked about, how I could support a man who was raised in a church where he was told, "God damn America." And anyway, it ticked me off, and I decided to take him on in the argument. And in the process, I constructed an argument in which I created a forced choice of that led finally to my asking: is there any situation in which, as a preacher, I could say, "God damn America"? And one of the issues that he is against is abortion. And so I, even in taking his issue and saying, isn't there any scenario? And in the end, what he finally ended up saying is no. In a sense, he would rather support abortion, which for him was something he couldn't do, than to speak against, I don't want to say the government, but the idolatry that exists, which is America. And I think that in that's where, for me, I started to think in terms of that's where the prophetic word needs to be. Is what is this new God we've created, and how exactly are we worshiping this God, and what is this God expecting us? And as a white rural guy myself, I look to black preachers to help us with that, because you spoke of being compromised a bit by the system, taken in by that. That's kind of the powerlessness that I sometimes feel. I just don't know how much a part of it I am, but I do look to black churches and black preachers to help with the prophetic word there.
I think I might have two responses as well to you that are not separate from one another. I've argued in the past that we need to look at why was Obama electable to begin with in our culture. Why was he electable? And Al Sharpton was not. Why was Obama electable? Jesse Jackson was not. Why was he electable and Shirley Chisholm was not? Dick Gregory was not. And I speculate on one of the reasons why he might have been electable to white America was because he might be the first black political candidate that did not run on a platform of protest, of political protest. He ran on a platform of the dominant cultural narrative of divine election, if he did even approach the question of our spiritual inheritance. Now, that was smart. I think it was maybe uncritical, but I think it was smart.
Why in this culture this is not a new phenomenon for human nature or for human cultures, to translate any form of political dominance into divine election. And this is problematic. It's problematic with most of our world religions. You know, the idea of in the nationalism in Judaism, in the formation of the Promised Land, all right, that it was by divine sanction that the Canaanite would be dispossessed. It's not a new formation of the Islamic conquest, because the people of the book couldn't get it right. It's not new to the formation of the quote-unquote New World. You know, for the sake of the salvation of the heathen, and for the sake of God's new Israel. And yet the form and fashion of our national narrative is the disposition of other peoples, the destruction of other peoples, and the import of those when those who were present weren't enough to dominate. Or did not serve. I do think that the challenge for us in the Jeremiah Wright chaos is how can, in the separation of church and state, how can the black church, and I think the priestly office might offer something here, help tell another story of God's interest in our political landscape? Is there another narrative that we can help this culture develop of our own faith identity that is based in heterogeneity? All right? Even when we fail to live into it from the day the ink hit paper. I argue that, you know, I'm not the first one. I manipulate or take advantage of a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1852. What is the 4th of July to us? What is the 4th of July to us? I don't call it Independence Day. But the 4th of November, 2008, when the narrative was actually given birth, when the least of these could inherit the democratic principle of freedom. That might be our Independence Day. Can we help define, reshape the narrative? That's what Mary Doak is trying to get us to do. How do you reclaim a public narrative, and where is the faith narrative operating with the national narrative? And where is the convergence of them in the public square? And I believe the black church, as the inheritor of rhetoric of resistance and the dialectic between the pastoral and the prophetic care, can help serve this redefining of our faith and narrative that can still be heterogeneous and still be faithful. They are not necessarily have to be antithetical in the public square. All faiths claim some special revelation. That's why we attach ourselves to them. There's biblical warrant for God revealing God's self to all peoples. As a matter of fact, it was a threat to the Israelites when they wouldn't get on board. You get on board, I'm going to go and do this work that I already began with the Philistines. So is it possible to can the black church reclaim that its acquisition of power is for the sake of helping to redefine the national narrative, the cultural narrative, the public narrative of what it means to be even a people? And we can still claim that we're a people of God, but we're a people of God that's in the world. The very world God is trying to reconcile, not conquer. Is God's mission conquest? Or is it a redefinition of our faith narrative? Mary, Dr.
Thank you. There's so much there. Want to talk longer and longer about this. One of the things that I'm remembering that bothered me the most about Reverend Wright and what didn't get generated, and this could lead to a question that you would need to give another couple of lectures on. What can the quote-unquote white church do? Was that nobody ever is allowed to talk about race, especially if you are considered to have it, as Obama did and does. And that's so problematic. So do you have some suggestions for, it seems to me it could be prophetic for there to be generated demands, prophetic demands, that this country have honest discussions about race, that it's not gone. I mean, as you know, color blindness has been cited and by many scholars, not to mention people who experience it, as the new form of racism. So the fact that no white communities ever came along and said, well, why can't we talk about race? We have it, and it comes with a certain kind of privilege, et cetera, et cetera. So what's my question? Can you imagine, or has that happened occasionally and I'm just not aware of it? Can you imagine that happening? What I'd attach to that is we could even have a sort of semi-secular national discourse that took seriously the fact that claiming you've made egregious errors and confessing that and asking to move on could be a way to think of our nation as having something to be proud of, that we're willing to acknowledge our egregious mistakes, so that Wright was in fact saying something that we should have said yes. One of the good things about being so-called American is that we can acknowledge our grievous sins. So any thoughts on that, Dale?
Repentance and forgiveness is a fascinating phenomenon, even the absence of them each. I consider myself an ally to womanist persons. I consider myself an ally to feminist persons. Womanists being black women, feminists being predominantly white women, but not necessarily, in literature, at least. I consider myself an ally, as I would consider myself an ally to African women, liberationists, etc. However, there have been times in my life where I've had a challenge, or I've received a challenge from a woman, and I don't know which I was more wounded by. The realization of my participation in the person's pain, or that the person didn't grant me forgiveness knowing who I am. And I say this in confession, this is not an illustration of righteousness. Okay, this is an illustration of confession. I'm using that as a window, perhaps, to what maybe white culture faces, all right, with issues of racism. That what I need to be confronted for my aversive sexism, just as this culture needs to be confronted for its aversive racism. That because I have seen or been caused to see overt sexism as problematic, and that my participation in it in the past has to stop, that how I have been shaped by it does not stop. And therefore how I still perpetuate it does not stop. And so I do need the other to confront me, but I also need the other to forgive me. But it becomes a position of arrogance for me to expect the woman confronting me to have forgiven me already. It might be my theological belief, but to place that expectation upon her without hearing her, and that my renewed repentance is part of the forgiving process, therefore I'm continuing to violate that woman if I cannot learn to accept that she's confronting me as an act of forgiveness, as well as an act of resistance. And we've got to find a way to get the culture of racism to say that I'm not going to stop resisting and I'm not going to stop confronting, but to you to place demands on me to give, for my approach to you to be forgive you for your ignorance. I'm sorry you're such an idiot. That's not forgiveness. That's arrogance. That's a mirror form of arrogance, of posturing, and with some sense of divine sanction. But the act of confrontation, the act of resistance, is an act of forgiveness because it seeks out reconciliation. If I weren't interested in reconciliation, I would continue with the theology of conquest and privilege, and whatever power I get, you better watch your back. But that's not my approach. That's not what I believe. I often have to tell myself when I get angry, when I feel the rage inside, Dale, that's what you feel, it's not what you believe. All right? A little cognitive self-therapy helps every once in a while. All right? It's what you feel, it's not what you believe. And when I feel hopeless in the face of relentless racism, I recognize, Dale, that's what I see, but it's not what I believe. Evidence of things hoped for. All right, so the work of this office in the public square is to not relinquish resistance, not to relinquish confrontation, but the task of teaching that confrontation seeks forgiveness, and that somehow we need the white church to get on board with this. The myth of a level playing field and equality is that. It's a myth. We have grown. We have grown to delegitimize lawful racism. We have grown to delegitimize violence and hatred that comes from the exchange between violence and hatred, at least among ourselves. We still rationalize hatred and violence. All right, we still have a ways to grow there, but we got hate crimes, for example, that we will delegitimize. But we will execute someone and not see it as a hate crime. When we claim the administration of the law is justice. I stood before, I'm sorry for giving such a long answer. I participated in about 2 years of protests against police slayings of African Americans in Louisville when I lived in Louisville. And it was led by a civil rights leader from the civil rights era. And we were called, there were 7 killings of African American by the hands of police within 5 years in the Louisville system. And some of them were criminals and some of them were fleeing from wrong accusation. Not that criminals deserve to be killed, and that's not my point. My point is that it took 2 years of weekly protests to get one grand jury indictment on probably the least provable case of the 7, as far as the misuse of police power. When the court sessions began, the judge called us, the leadership group before the court, before they were choosing the jury, to ask us to put certain parameters on our protest for the sake of preserving the integrity of the jury pool selection process. And we agreed to do that. But in her explanation of why she's asking this of us,
And when a judge asks, it's more than a request, right? But while she was asking this of us, she started to teach us that whatever, and these were her words, whatever the outcome of this trial is, that is justice. And I kind of looked over at the leader, Lewis Coleman, the civil rights leader, because my ears perked up. And I kind of looked, and he just like, let it go, let it go. But the idea is when we confuse the administration of the law with justice, when we confuse the eradication of legalized oppression, when we confuse that with justice, we have not begun to reconstruct the national narrative or the cultural narrative of equality or liberation itself. And so we have to work at how does the acts of resistance teach us that confrontation is an act of trust, is an act of vulnerability, is an act of investment into reconciliation or forgiveness. And I'm sorry to go on such a tangent, but I hope you forgive me for that.
So much to think about and talk about. I want to take you to that little storefront church where the prosperity gospel is being preached, and I'm wondering if there's some reason that the prosperity gospel is taking hold, and I want to ask you to look at those very disenfranchised groups and groups that bear the weight of this legal system that you just described and the deprivations and violence of poverty weighing down on them, and this prosperity gospel is taking hold. What is that about? And what does it tell all of us preachers that we need to be saying?
It's a great question to press. There was a time in life when I would be among those poor. And I believed, and I still do believe, that God was interested in my liberation from poverty. And I would pray for liberation from poverty. And not only on a macro level, but every micro level of empty pocketness I ever encountered. All right, and part of the belief system that we've developed in our theological narratives is that God is interested in alleviating suffering. Why does God not answer every prayer for alleviation of suffering in the way we pray it? If I could answer that question, this lecture would be meaningless. But the idea is that we believe God when you're from the position of oppression, from racial position of oppression, from poverty oppression, from gender oppression, we believe that God is interested in our liberation from that oppression. And that liberation from that oppression is on the macro social level, and it's on the micro interpersonal level and the immediate daily level. So there have been times when we pray to eat that day, and we also pray to get that job to eat next year. But we also pray, we also believe in God's interest to bless us, not just to liberate us. All right, that God loves us so much that God seeks to bless us. And so we seek God's blessing, but it's in that distortion of God's interest to liberate us from oppression and what we believe in God's interest to bless us, that we distort that as end goals of God. God saying, I did it. But when it's the same distortion we give to personal salvation, I believe. As if personal salvation or my immediate liberation from oppression is the end goal for God. It doesn't mean that I'm ever absent from God. I'm never absent from God's goals. But maybe personal salvation
or my immediate liberation isn't God's ultimate goal. Quite frankly, maybe it's a means. It doesn't mean that the means absents me from God's desire to bless me. That I'm a means doesn't mean that I'm absent from God's desire to love me, but it means that God's love doesn't end in that act and doesn't end with me. And that maybe personal salvation or God providing my meal for today is God's act to bless me as well as a beginning again. All right, and that we distort God's faithfulness or God's promise to never give up. Even when people are dying next to us, we still pray. When we see people, when our family dies from hunger, when our family dies at the hands of racial injustice, we still pray for divine blessing and divine deliverance. What else do we have but God's interest in delivering God's humanity? So we won't give that up, nor do I think we should. But we distort what God is about ultimately, all right? And we tend to separate them, and it's a false separation. I just don't think they're separated. Even when we don't understand God's silence, when we don't understand God's apparent distance, the silence is not God's ultimate goal, nor is the blessing just to my life God's ultimate goal, but it's how God is operating with humanity and expecting humanity to participate in God's work with humanity. And we distort that in storefront churches and poverty churches or racial resistant churches. We distort that because we distort that God's goal is in the acquisition of blessing or the dispensing of blessing. And when we distort God's interest into the dispensation of blessing only, all right, then it's the acquisition of blessing becomes a product. So why do we believe in the prosperity gospel? Because we can't give up the theological narrative to prosper as God's goal. And we do the same we have the same problem in our political national narrative. Why do poor people get on board with tax cuts to the wealthiest? Why is it not a moral outrage just in the political landscape that 1 or 2% of the population gets most of the tax cuts in our taxation in a recession? Because our national narrative does not want to give up the prospect of prosperity. Because if I buy into that wholesome, then I limit my acquisition of prosperity. And so we confuse these, I think, in the political landscape and in theological landscape. But that I'm no longer poor. But there are days, about the third week of the month, when you get paid once a month, I still go to that prayer closet. Lord, I got 7 more days and 3 kids here. All right. I know I'm not poor. I know I can find what I need to find, and that my liberation is only 7 days away. I still say the same prayer, those who do not know how far away their liberation is. Maybe there's a problem when all I pray is for my liberation 7 days away. All right? And there's a problem when I'm part of the storefront, when all I pray is to be able to acquire prosperity that's within my grasp. It's a distortion of God's faithfulness, where God is contractually bound to an equation. So what happens? I give so that God will bless me fourfold. How do you distort God's faithfulness to bless your commitment to God seeking to care for one another into a contractual binding covenant where now God is obligated to cause your storehouse to overflow? And we distort that. And It's the brilliance of the manna narrative of, rotting in your hands beyond God's intended blessing. And maybe our prosperity will rot in our hand when we employ it for our own sake beyond God's intended blessing. But great question.
I think we have time for this one last question I see over here.
Hey.
I had the luxury of studying with him at Boston University School of Theology, so you do not disappoint. My question is, you had mentioned in your lecture that there is a changing hearership, that was the word you used, in the black church. And I see that and I experience that in my own life, in that I have friends who are part of the black church, but they are not black. And I have friends who are not part of the black church because they don't feel like they fit in the black church. And so that's definitely a piece of it. And identity, I think, has a large role to play in that. So I'm curious about how you're seeing the church changing in now as opposed to the church that we saw, for example, during the civil rights movement. And I can hear a lot of echoes of what you're talking about in relationship to that. But if you could further talk about specifically what you see and what you're observing and sort of your how you're responding to that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. There's a comedian who cracks me up. His name is Lavelle Crawford. And he has this one line when he's talking about Obama getting into the White House. And he goes in and he says, people who claim about Obama is not black enough, and they challenge it. Even the black community claim Obama's not black enough. And Crawford goes, well, I think Obama's black enough. He was black enough to get in the White House. He couldn't be Flavor Flav black and get into the White House. Obama is black enough. And what that says to me is that we distort racial identity and cultural identity into some monolithic presence in our culture. And that we forget that we got a whole range of blackness in this very room. We've got a whole range of prosperity or how we identify ourselves with the dominant culture in this room. And that's where I locate that what Asante was pressing us with the hearership is, one question I ask when I teach a black preaching course: do you have to be black to preach black preaching? All right? And it's never failed to be, for the whole semester, issue of contention. What makes preaching black preaching? Is it the preacher being black? Now, everyone can think of all kinds of examples on both sides of the argument. I've met a few black preachers that were never came close to black preaching, right? And I've met a few white preachers that I thought, damn, that sounded black to me. I do think the experience of life plays a factor in black preaching. So where one locates oneself in the continuum informs how one preaches. So if I'm going to preach to a women's group, a women's liberation organization, I'm not going to preach in the we. We got to resist male dominance and patriarchy. We got to resist the man. But where I locate myself in my cultural identity or my gender identity or my race identity on the continuum informs how I'm able to be an ally in black preaching, or how I'm able to be an ally in feminist preaching or womanist preaching. And so I engage it where from the perspective of difference, seeking reconciliation from a position of allyship. So that you don't need to be black to participate in black preaching, but don't preach like you black. Don't preach in the voice of a black person. Preach in the voice of an ally to black preaching, in the form of the rhetoric of resistance, the rhetoric of refusal for the dehumanization of humanity and the oppression and the political marginalization of humanity. Preach that, and I'll confuse you with black preaching. And it would be a welcomed confusion. And that's how I would address it. Is that, well, you know, Obama's black enough. In the sense of he's trying to figure out a way in the political landscape to, I actually think he's being pretty smart. I don't think he gets aversive racism thoroughly. I don't think his March 2008 speech about racism showed me that there are some problems with his argument on cultural racism, but I think he's actually quite insightful about how a black man in this culture is going to be able to work at political reconciliation in resisting the oppressions that our culture has participated in. All right? And in that sense, I kind of like Crawford's line. Well, you know, he ain't Flavor Flav black, but he's black enough. So that's how I would answer that. Thank you for your indulgence.